Before I started the handle installation, I went ahead and ground the file teeth off of the blade side of the knife. I did this because I figure if I have to clean this, having all those little grooves in the edge would make it very difficult to clean, especially if I use this for processing game, and I really won't have to worry about that, so I ground them smooth. I kind of affected the overall look of the knife, but I don't think it'll affect functionality in any way, shape, or form. Since I didn't have a drill bit that would drill through the file, I went ahead and put a cutoff wheel on my Dremel tool and cut a slot in the tang for the handle pin. This worked, although it did present some problems that you'll see later in the video. Next, I cut out my handle pin from a scrap piece of metal. The first one I cut actually ended up being too short, but it worked well for getting everything sized up before final assembly. Next, I cut the handle material for the scales. This is just an oak pallet slat, and it worked out quite well, although I did cut it a bit oversized because I was worried about my glue up and getting everything lined up. But in retrospect, I should have cut this a lot smaller because when it came time to grind the handle down, it took a very long time to remove all the excess material. Next, I lined up the scale material with the tang of the knife. I did this by laying the knife on top of one piece of scale material and then pounding the shorter pin I made through the slot in the tang to make an indentation in the handle scale. Next, I clamped both pieces together and drilled a hole through each end. My original intention had been to drill the rest of the holes with the pieces clamped together, but my drill bit kept drifting. So once I had both end holes marked, I just pulled them apart and drilled all the holes separately. I then ended up using a small file to kind of file out the slot. That's where using a slotted piece of metal instead of a round pin really added a lot of work to attach these handle scales. But considering my tools, I thought this was the best option, and in the end it worked out quite well. The next step was to epoxy on the handle scales. I ended up using way too much epoxy here. I was afraid I wouldn't have enough, and then when I clamped everything together, I had a lot of squeeze out, but everything did get a good coating, thankfully. I also kind of made a mistake with my epoxy. I bought what I thought was 5-minute epoxy, but it turns out it was 5-minute epoxy that sets in 5 minutes, but takes approximately 24 hours to cure. So once the epoxy's on there, I was pretty much done for the day and had to wait, and then I went off to hunting season. So my epoxy actually sat for about a week before I got back to shaping the handles. The first step in shaping the scales was to trim off all the excess. On the sides and bottom, I did a majority of this with my radial arm saw, but I ended up using a hand saw to even out the top side of the scales and to trim a little bit more off the sides. This saved a lot of time because when it came time to shape the scales, I really wish that I would have used a much thinner scale material, possibly even taking this board and cutting it in half. But as kind of a lesson learned, and I wanted to make sure I had extra, so when it came time to shape the scales, I had a little bit of room to screw up and then sand down even more. As you can see here, when I started shaping the scales, I used literally every wood shaping tool I could find in my shop, but what I finally settled on was my benchtop grinder. It took a long time doing this because this wheel is not really meant for grinding wood, but it seemed to work out well, and in the end, I was pretty happy with the end result. One thing I wish I would have had was a flap wheel for my right angle grinder. I feel like that would have been a good way to take off a lot of the excess material. But in the end, this worked, and it only took me probably 2 hours to shape this handle. Lastly, I used some tung oil to seal up the handle. I like the way tung oil looks, and I happen to have it on hand, but you could use just about anything you want in this step. If you found this video helpful or informative, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you have any suggestions on what I could have done differently or what you'd like to see in the future, please leave a comment down below.